Hello, welcome back to another episode of History Hack. Just to remind you all, this is our brand new relaunch of History Hack. We have a brand new website, www.historyhack.co.uk. You will find all our fabulous bios written by, obviously, Alexandra Churchill. Go and check them out. She is a fabulous writer. Also, our Beardy Weirdy cartoonist has set up some fabulous new cartoons up there. If you like us, you can leave us a 5-star shiny review on Apple. You know that you can type in whatever you like. For example, Alina is the best in the world will be greatly appreciated. If you want to give us a one-off donation, we won't say no to that. I need to feed my dogs, and like I said before, I need to fund that plant habit. No, not weed, as Alex has kindly reminded you. That you can find on www.ko-fi.com/historyhack. Like I said, any donations very much appreciated. If you do like us, hit us up as a Patreon supporter. That range from a virtual Uber Eats dinner date with Chris to your very own virtual cartoon. This brings us to start our fabulous episode. I'm really excited about this one. We have with us Guy Bowman, who's written a fabulous new book on the Great Epinal Escape, Indian prisoners of war in German hands. Welcome, Guy. It's great to have you on the episode.
I'm fine, thank you, Chris. Good morning, good afternoon, and Alina as well. Hello, how are you?
I'm great. I'm actually really interested in this, considering you have two historians that work, well, Chris does work on World War II as much as I do, and I have never heard of this story before, and I'm really excited to learn a little bit more, because you hear about the Great Escape, you hear about D-Day, you hear about stuff that happens in the Pacific, but an Indian army in a prisoner system and an escape. I think we should just dive straight into this one. So, basically, we tend to think of the Indian Army as being deployed in the Far East. As I said, that's what you predominantly listen to, predominantly hear. But they were also deployed in Britain's fight against Germany, weren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. At different times and in different places, but starting with the subject of my first book, which was Indian soldiers who were in Europe, in France with the British Expeditionary Force, 1939 to 1940. That was a small amount of men, but they were there, and of those, about 320 were captured by the Germans in June of 1940. So they were the first Indian prisoners of war held by the Germans. They were followed by prisoners who were taken by the Italians. So in the first, there were prisoners who were taken in East Africa, so in, around Ethiopia and so on. Most of those were then freed when the Italians were defeated in 1941, but some of them were transferred to Europe. The next lot were then prisoners who were taken in North Africa, and this is where the bulk of these prisoners came from. So the the 8th Army in North Africa was an international army. I mean, there were Brits there in large numbers, but there were Australians and Kiwis, South Africans, people from elsewhere in Africa, and large amounts of Indians as well. So particularly the Indian 4th Division, the Indian 5th Division. And they were, kind of part of that whole sweep of attacking back and forth east and west across the desert, from 1940 through till eventually 1943, when the Germans were finally kicked out of North Africa, and along that way, Indians were taken prisoner at Tobruk, particularly in 42, with the fall of Tobruk, and then the campaigns around that time. Quite large amounts of Indians were taken by the Italians and the Germans, taken prisoner there. So, and then some other places as well in small numbers. So, for example, there were Indian prisoners of war taken in Greece in 41. So when the British force there, or rather the Commonwealth force there, was defeated, and before Crete, there was a small amount of Indians who were taken prisoner there in Greece and other places as well. So by the kind of summer of 43, there were around 15,000 Indian prisoners of war who were being held by the Germans in total.
So how did they find the POW system? Was it different for the Indian prisoners than it would be for the white British prisoners, bearing in mind the Nazi ideology?
That's a very good question, Chris. And the Nazi ideology was complicated. In terms of the kind of hierarchy of who is a better
Mm.
person, who's a better race than who else. So as far as the Nazis were concerned, at the bottom were the Jews and black people, black soldiers. Of whom there were quite a few in German hands. And also Russians, Slavs, so they were kind of at the bottom, really. Those were the worst treated in the prisoner of war camps. Because the Soviet Union hadn't signed the Geneva Convention, their prisoners, the prisoners taken by the Germans from the Red Army, were probably the worst treated of all in terms of prisoners. And then military prisoners, and then of course the Jews who were not military prisoners at all, but who were civilians from Eastern Europe and elsewhere in Europe, civilians who had been captured, not captured, but who had been taken into camps and were being murdered in large amounts. They were the worst treated of all, I guess. So on the whole. And another aspect to this is that from the Nazi point of view, there was this idea of the Aryan, and the Aryan, in inverted commas, was a kind of race, in inverted commas. I'm using a lot of inverted commas here. I don't know how you do that on the radio. The Aryan was an idea that these people had come from kind of northern India, in fact, that the Aryan race, in inverted commas, had come from northern India and spread across Europe, and that therefore the white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nazi ideal was closely related to the people of northern India. So in some ways, there was some Nazi ideology saw that actually, Indians were a good race, a better race than some other Europeans. So it's really complicated and strange, the Nazi ideology. But what that meant in practice was that the thing that determined really how any prisoner of war was treated by the Germans was basically their uniform. So if you were in a khaki uniform, if you were in a British-style khaki uniform, regardless of where you had come from, you were treated more or less the same as white British people. And so that included Jewish prisoners who were in the British Army or in the Pioneer Corps, recruited from the Middle East directly, or as some quite often happened, people who'd been German, who were German Jewish refugees who'd come to Britain, joined the British Army, and then being captured by the Germans. They were generally treated the same as if they were a white British soldier. So, in short, the answer is not too bad, really, not too bad. It could have been a hell of a lot worse.
I find this very interesting because I went to Lambsdorff last year and spent
Oh,
time with
right.
one of the deputy director, and we went around. And obviously, Lambsdorff was split into two. So you had the British and the Allied section, and then the Soviets and the Poles were kept like far away, and that's where they were treated completely completely inhumanely. But coming to
Yeah.
this point about that you said about the prisoners who were in a British uniform were completely treated all equally, the director of the museum said that was true. However, anybody that was a person of color was treated not so equally by their own rather than the German authorities.
That's an interesting point, and that reflects some of what I've heard and read and seen and written about. Yeah, I mean, it's and in Lambsdorff there were I don't know how many exactly, but a few hundred Indian prisoners of war who went through Lambsdorff at different times. And of course, this was a camp that was almost entirely other ranks from the British Army. And I've read some reports by Brits and other Commonwealth, white British and other Commonwealth soldiers who kind of see that difference. I haven't had that confirmed from any Indian sources, but I'm sure it's true that the racism that existed within the British Empire And of course, that was different in different parts of the British Empire as well. It's worth saying, but that that racism, that discrimination was also, present within amongst the Commonwealth population within a camp like Lambsdorff. I think that's true. Yeah.
From the German perspective as well, sort of as the war went on, they tried, if I remember correctly, they tried to treat the Indian prisoners better because they were trying to recruit them. Was it Chandra Bose had come over to Germany and they were trying to spark an Indian revolution, and so there was an SS Indian regiment being formed. I think they only got like 22 volunteers, but there was a lot of, if we treat them well, they might join our cause and rebel against the British.
Yeah, very, very important thread that really. So Subhas Chandra Bose was he'd been the president of the Congress Party before the war, and he came from that part of Indian political thinking which said that, there's no point in fighting on the side of the British. They are our oppressors. If we want to get rid of them, we have to fight against them. There's no point in, doing what Gandhi and Nehru were doing, which was kind of, non-violent resistance, going to prison themselves, or other Indian politicians who were very firmly in favor of the British war effort. Like, for example, to some extent, the Muslim League, and indeed the Unionist Party in Punjab, who were very much in favour of supporting the British position. So Bose himself was imprisoned at the beginning of the war. He was, briefly, yes, he came to Europe and he recruited amongst those German prisoners of war, and actually he had some success. I mean, they recruited about 3,000, so it was quite a reasonable number that he recruited, who then fought, who joined the German army to fight against the British. The Legion Freies Indien, it was called the Free German Legion, or the Azad Hind Fauj, as it's referred to in India, and they were, officered by Germans, wearing German uniforms, carrying German arms. They were stationed initially in the Netherlands and then down in the southwest of France near Bordeaux. And they were there, at the time of D-Day, and then they retreated across Germany to the northeast and eventually were largely recaptured. They didn't have a significant military role. As much as anything else, their role was a propaganda one, really. But they were much smaller. I mean, Bose himself relocated to Asia and recruited a much larger, what was called the Indian National Army, from prisoner of war camps, but also from Indian civilians in Asia who fought on the side of the Japanese.
So I just decided to pop the word Frontstalag. Obviously, I didn't just randomly think of the name. Chris has it on the question list, but I thought I'd Google the camp, the prisoner of war camp. So just for our listeners, Frontstalag 315. And if you look through, you've got these incredible and very powerful images that pop up of Indian soldiers. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, Frontstalag was so Stalag is a Stammlager, a branch, a route camp, a main camp, trunk camp, a camp for non-commissioned officers and other ranks. And a Frontstalag was a camp that was not in Germany itself, but outside of that. So in France or elsewhere, kind of, in territory that the Germans had occupied. So there were lots of them in France. A lot of the colonial troops that were captured, the French colonial troops that were captured by the Germans in 1940 were in Frontstalags. Frontstalag 315 was in Epinal. So this is a small city, I guess you'd call it, in the northeast of France on the River Moselle. And it's a very pretty place, actually. And the camp was in it's a barracks that had been built by the French in the 1880s originally. And was, as a fairly decent building, had been used as a camp earlier in the Second World War, as a prison camp earlier in the Second World War for French colonial prisoners. And then at the beginning of 1944, large amounts of Indians arrived there. So there were about 3,000 of them at the peak. Large amounts of Indians arrived there and were occupying these large I think they're 4 or 5 story buildings that look very clearly like a barrack. So it's not like one of these, like Stalag Luft 3 in the kind of in the forest with huts that were purpose built. It's a barracks really, and they were there in these big buildings, and they were separated out. So a building for Muslims, a building for Sikhs, building for Hindus. And yeah, there are quite a few photos. I mean, I assume the photos you found are from the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross. They visited the camp, twice before it was bombed and then once afterwards. And they took some quite good photos, including photos in February 44 taken in the snow, which are rather evocative. And then later, after the bombardment, taken, which show the incredible devastation that happened to the camp in May that year.
Which leads me to the next question of what did happen on the 11th of May 1944.
11th of May 1944. So the Epinal is as I say, not a very big city, but it was a relatively important railway junction and railway line. And the Americans and the British were engaged in large-scale bombing across northern France, Belgium, Germany itself. The Americans bombing by day, the RAF bombing by night, attempting to disrupt the transportation system in the lead up to D-Day, and doing that with some success. And on the 11th of May, the bombing raid was against Epinal itself and some other towns and cities around there, including the very important Belfort, which is right further down south and east from there. And the American Air Force, in large numbers, approached to bomb the railway station. So it's a valley, right? It's a north-south valley. The River Moselle runs along there. The road is parallel to the river, and the railway line is parallel to that as well. And the railway station is near the river, kind of at the bottom of this valley. So the Americans came in from the west, from Britain. They were based in East Anglia. So it's very much like these Masters of Air that we have at the moment, these Liberator bombers with their crews, and doing this extraordinary thing of daylight bombing with large amounts of fighter cover. So, in fact, there were 3 waves of fighters that were supporting them. One whole load that came with them from East Anglia, another load that covered the actual bombing event, and then a third lot who covered them on the return back to Britain. They came in, they dropped their bombs on the railway and the area, the railway, the station, the marshalling yards, which is what they'd intended to, but a lot of the bombs weren't on target. And some of them, probably at least 30, were dropped on the prisoner of war camp, which was on the hill about a kilometre, I'd say, away from the railway station, and terrible devastation. So, and there are some very good reports by Indians about actually what happened there. But their bombs were dropping on the buildings, on the barbed wire, in the area in between. They were playing a football game at the time, so some of the guys were killed there in the courtyard where they were playing football, and about at least 70 of them were killed. There's going to be actually a commemoration event on the 80th anniversary of the 11th of May 2024. The local French community are going to put up a plaque there at the prisoner of war camp, and I'm very honoured to have been invited to join them for that. And so it's still remembered there in the city. So about 70 of them are killed, and they're buried in the cemetery there, the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. And large amounts of them to some extent they were told by the Germans to get out of this area, because it's becoming a maelstrom, it's becoming a terrible catastrophe. To some extent they think, well, let's get out of here, so it's a bit unclear quite what the German attitude was, but I think the German attitude was confused, really, because it's a confusing situation. It's in the middle of the day, by the way. It's in the middle of the afternoon. And so to the west of the camp, the land kind of slopes away. And you can still see some of this now. It slopes away in a kind of wheat field, then it drops down to a sort of ravine, and then there's a little lake. There's an old arsenal which is still there, and then there's kind of the woods. So this is a very wooded part of eastern France. So in fact, Epinal is known as the wood capital. They do lots of things using the local harvest of wood. So the Indians kind of think, well, let's get out of here. So some of them grab some provisions, and some of them had already been planning for escape. And they in large numbers they run away, and they go towards the woods to the west, which is perhaps not the best direction to go initially, but they're just getting away from the bombers. A lot of them sort of camp out that night close by. Some of them run away immediately and start going towards Switzerland. Some of them, do that the next day. But I think there's a realization over the course of the next few hours that this is an opportunity. Really, this is an unparalleled opportunity. I don't think they necessarily know how far it is to Switzerland, but they know that Switzerland is a neutral country. Some of them had tried to escape before. They know that this is an opportunity that won't happen again.
Right. So they've escaped. Some of them have stayed locally. Some of them have fled. Some of them end up trekking. What is it? About 100 kilometers from Epinal to Boncourt. I mean, how does that go?
Yeah. Well, it's at least 100 kilometers. So it's about 100 kilometers in the quickest route to get to Switzerland. So Boncourt is the nearest part of Switzerland. So if you look at a map, you'll see that on that kind of northwest corner of Switzerland, it sticks out. The Swiss frontier sticks out into France. So the town on the French side is called Del, and on the Swiss side it's called Boncourt. So it's interesting. It goes in a very varied way for different soldiers. I mean, there's two of them. The two quickest make it in about 4 days, and cross over on the I think it's the 15th. And they're walking. They're trudging through the woods, through the hills. It's when I first heard the story, I kind of pictured the sound of music. That's the kind of. It's not really quite like that territory, but it is a bit like that. It's high. It's not mountains, but it's hills. It's wooded. It's not very densely populated until you get to this kind of. The bit where the ground drops down and you get to Belfort, which is this very important, the Belfort Gap it's called, and it's a very important throughway for military over thousands of years. So just picture you've got Gurkhas, you've got Sikhs, you've got Muslims, Hindus, some Indian Christians as well. And even apparently, according to one story, which I'm afraid to confirm, there is one amongst them who is a North American, Native American Canadian guy from Montreal. I haven't managed to confirm this story, but that apparently is the case. So these guys, all these different types walking along, going with probably nothing to eat after the first day or so. So they're kind of scavenging, living off the land and what the French give them. Following the high tension power lines, that becomes a very important thing that people say, look, these lines are going to take you towards Switzerland. And getting then down to this bit where they have to cross, roads and rivers and skirt round the city, the fortified city of Belfort, and eventually getting to the Swiss frontier with, lots of great adventures along the way, and luckily for me as a historian, lots of people, Indians had written about it, French people had written about it. So there is a reasonably large amount of documentation preserved in the archives.
Mentioning the French, did the Indian soldiers get much help from the French civilians as they were going through?
Yes, enormous amount of help. And that, I think, is really something that for me stands out from this story is, the fortitude of the Indians and the kind of, recovering from that trauma of being literally bombed and shot at by the Germans, and then kind of walking, in that sort of very kind of dogged way. And some of them, as I say, took a matter of days. For some of them, it was a lot longer. But then that is backed up by generosity of civilians along the way. So particularly, there's a village by the name of Etobon, which is more than halfway there, I guess. It's a very small village, and it's kind of slightly almost on the edge of where the ground drops away towards the frontier and towards Belfort. And here there's a tradition of helping the strangers, but in this village they help literally hundreds of them, and they shelter them in the village, in the vicarage, because this is actually a Protestant village. And there's a wonderful man by the name of Jules Perret, who is the blacksmith and farrier of the village, and he keeps a diary. But it's not like a normal it's not like a normal book where you write every day what happened, because he was acutely aware of the danger of the Germans kind of finding his notes. So he writes his notes on little pieces of paper. He squirrels them away in his pockets, and he puts them in. And then that evening he puts them in bottles, and he hides them away in different parts of of his farm. And then only years later, after the war, does he actually collate them and bring them together. So they're very immediate. They're very much, this is what he wrote on that day. Or quite often he's writing several times during the day. So on one day he's kind of saying, oh, look, there's 5 more of these Indians have arrived. And then, at 2 hours later, oh my gosh, there's another 6 of them. Where are we going to find enough food? And, and then later that day there's more again, and it goes on. And it's just superbly written. I mean, it's really the most extraordinary account. So they're feeding them, they're giving them clothes, they are looking after them when they get ill. One of them actually dies when he's staying there with them. And they're taking them on their way. And that's really, a lot of these guys are being helped along the route. So it's rather like the much more well-known escape routes that are happening from Brussels and from elsewhere in France that are going towards the Pyrenees. So the Pat line and the Comet line, this is a bit like that, with the local resistance who are taking them on just a matter of a few kilometers down the road, as it were, to the next farmhouse or the next village, and then they take them on from there. So enormous amounts of assistance is given by the French.
I want to make a comment, and then I'm going to ask my question. There is a big difference here between 1944 and what was happening in 1939, 1940, more 1940, because the French civilians seemed to want to help, but in the early part of the war, they didn't. So, for example, a lot of Polish soldiers were handed over to the Germans, or over in the Pyrenees to the Spanish, to basically just kind of get rid of them, get them out of the way. So I'm kind of hoping your answer to the next question is going to be also positive, but I can see you're laughing, and it's not going to be positive, is it?
What's the question, Alina?
Were the French resistance any help?
Right. Yeah, to some extent. I mean, yes, they were helpful, and the resistance and the citizenry, the peasants of that part of France were the same people, So Jules Perret, who I was just talking about, he was he had fought in the First World War. I mean, he was already in his early 60s by this stage, and he was part of the resistance now in 1944. But I think you're absolutely right. There is a massive difference between 1940 and 1944, and that distance is partly, it's about morale. It's about the feeling of where is French public opinion? Where is the French, feeling, the French sentiment, the emotions at this time in the war? By this time, they've been through a lot of hardship. And there's been widespread collaboration, absolutely. There is, that collaboration is continuing. But a lot of French opinion is turning towards the Allies away from Marshal Pétain and the Vichy regime. Even though, I mean, so those air raids of May the 11th that happened in Belfort and in Epinal, large amounts of French civilians were killed, particularly in Epinal on that first air raid, as they were killed elsewhere in France during that summer. But on the whole, the impression I get from Jules Perret and his companions in his village is that they were prepared to accept that as part of the price, I guess, of getting rid of the Germans. So the resistance, was helping these escaping Indians, and there are stories of them being helped along the way by armed men. And there are also stories of them joining the resistance. There's quite a few of these Indians who decide, well, I could go across the border into Switzerland. I say that as if it's something incredibly easy to do. It wasn't something incredibly easy to do. Or I can stay behind and actually join in the fight. And there are several, fairly well documented stories of that, and Indians who end up getting decorations, who end up getting medals because of that. The memories of the French, on the whole, and there are lots of memories. It was kept in French books, archives, témoignages, witness statements. Generally, the memories are more kind of we the French helping the Indians rather than them helping us. And in they don't necessarily carry that same perspective or that same angle on it, and maybe that's understandable as well. People remember the events of 1944 partly through the filter of what happened after that and what happened before that, and how they want to construct their national memory in retrospect. And that's true in Britain as it is in France, as it is in India and Pakistan, really.
So for the ones that did make it to Switzerland or did decide to go to Switzerland, what was it like when they got there? I'm guessing they were interned quite quickly.
Yes, I mean I would say they were welcomed. And they made it in large numbers. I mean the truth of it is that the Great Escape of Stalag Luft 3 was a large escape. There were 79 who got out. There were more who were intending to get out, and there were 50 who were murdered by the Germans. There were only 3 who made it back to Britain. In this case, in Epinal, there were 500. 500 made it to Switzerland and subsequently made it back to, were taken to Britain, which is a lot. It's the largest, it's the single largest prisoner of war escape of the Second World War. The numbers who escaped is probably 800 or so, and 500 made it to neutral Switzerland. So they were, as I say, it was over a period of several weeks that they were arriving in this western part of Switzerland. They were welcomed. There were lots of stories in Switzerland as well, in this town of Boncourt and around that area. Lots of photos of them, and they were, kind of administratively processed. And luckily that's a good thing, because there's a card for them. Each one of them has a record card that is still preserved in the Swiss National Archives, which is great for me as a historian. And they were taken initially to camps in the north of Switzerland, German-speaking areas, sort of around Egerkingen and kind of in between, sort of west of Zurich. And then in due course, partly because the Swiss were worried again about the possibility of a German invasion. I mean, that was kind of a serious concern in the summer of 1944 after D-Day, was that the Germans would actually, need to want to make better defenses by going through Switzerland. So the German POWs and other POWs or other internees who were being held in that northern and northwestern part of Switzerland were taken elsewhere. So the Indians were taken to the south, to the far south, to the Italian area, and put in a couple of camps right down in the south, near the Italian border, and near the those wonderful lakes in between the mountains. And there they were, fairly happy, fairly well looked after. Unfortunately, there aren't any Italian there aren't any Indian testimonies from that time, I'm afraid. The memories that are there are by British officers or by the Swiss themselves, and some collected by local Italian Swiss historians. But yeah, they were well looked after. They were eating well. They were playing football again. They were going out for walks. They were meeting local people. They were forming friendships, possibly romantic friendships. There were certainly romantic friendships when they were in the northern part of Switzerland. Possible romantic friendships here in the south as well. Certainly, the local paper reported that when they eventually left from that camp in the south at Locarno, that there were lots of Italian women, Swiss Italian women at the station waving their handkerchiefs and weeping as they left. So, let's face it, these are handsome guys. These are handsome young men, who were kind of, keen to learn languages and keen to fraternize and keen to exchange, foodstuffs and chat and meet people, as they did across the world. Extraordinary experiences of young men being posted all around the world, meeting local people and making friendships. So yeah, they had a reasonably good experience in Switzerland.
So there's one good experience. However, not everybody managed to escape out of this camp, and it gets bombed again.
Yeah.
Tell us about what happened there.
Well, yeah, so this is later the same month in May 44, the Americans come back, and there's some more bombing and some more, actually most of those who'd survived had been evacuated off to other camps. They'd gone to Nancy and to other camps around in France, around that part of France, but some of them were still there, and in due course, a lot of them came back to Epinal. But yeah, another bombing that happened on the 22nd of May. And again, more Indians killed, more French killed. But actually, at this stage, they're getting better at the French were getting better at observing the kind of air raid precautions. No more escape on that occasion, but there are some more who escaped later. I mean, I think there's one thing that happened at this stage is that the Indians had kind of got they'd maybe got the idea that escaping was a possibility, that actually this could work. We can go, we can trudge across the fields and get away. And so there were more escapes. And in fact, there was an escape at that time in June, a bit later, when 4 of the escapers were rounded up and shot out of hand by the German guards. And after the war, there was an attempt to find the culprits and bring them to justice, but that wasn't successful. So that sense that is true, with the Great Escape, the Stalag Luft 3 Great Escape, and that sense that was true more and more over that period of 44 to 45, that the Germans were really losing control of their discipline, of the attachment to the Geneva Convention, of the kind of rules of how you're supposed to conduct war. That sense, that's true there as well, that there's a kind of indiscriminate killing of people trying to leave.
Brings us quite nicely to, because as the war went on and the Reich starts to collapse, POWs start getting moved all over the place. You end up with death marches when they're moving them from the east to the west. How do the Indian POWs, still in German control, experience the collapse of Germany?
Yeah, it's quite a mixed experience, really. I mean, a lot of them do go on these death marches. Some of them going westwards, from Lambsdorff, for example, there are Indian prisoners of war on that march, but also some of them going eastwards from camps in France, further into the Reich itself. And there is, and those camps afford the opportunity for escape, and there are more stories of escape there. There is more further loss of life, and at this time some of that is by the RAF, who are attacking columns. And it's kind of, it gets increasingly chaotic and tragic, and I think if you were, I think a lot of them would have kind of breathed a sigh of relief that they managed to get away in 44 when they did. A lot of their compatriots were really having an awful time. I mean, can I tell you the story of Jay Lal, by the way? I've kind of would like to, this is, there is a lot of kind of sort of stories that aren't very clear. But the story of Jalal is an extraordinary story. So he was one of the ones who did escape from Epinal. He was a Lance Knight in the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. So he was a driver. He'd been captured in North Africa. He was a young man from Haryana, so the area just west of Delhi, and his family still live in the same village. And he got out on the 11th of May. He journeyed south. He took a slightly different route, and he found himself in a barn, having a snooze in the middle of the day a few days later. And then he's woken up by a vision of beauty, according to the stories. I haven't actually seen a photo of her, but a young French girl who wakes him up, and instantly they fall in love, and this is the story, and they get together, and he gets involved in the local resistance, according to his account. So he tells his story to the Indian Army newsletter when he gets back to India. According to his account, he leads the local resistance. He becomes the kind of the commander of them there in this place. That's not borne out by the local resistance as they remember it, but it nevertheless, it's a kind of it's this great romantic story, and I think it would be quite something if that did come to be truth. And I suppose from my point of view as a historian, it's really interesting that I've found this story showing up in his accounts, and then also in the British archives. He was given a very high medal, the Indian Order of Merit, and also to some extent in the French memories. I've interviewed the family, the members of the Nede. So the girl was called Denise Nede, and her brothers were at the local resistance. So I've interviewed people who remembered him. And it's interesting to see how the story, how these different angles don't match. But anyway, his version of the story was the beautiful Denise wakes him up. He leads the local resistance. They fight against the Germans. They get married, even in the local church. And unfortunately, there's no record of this in the local church, I found, or in the local mairie. And in due course, the Americans advance up that part of eastern France in September that year, and he kind of then is repatriated, and he tries to actually bring Denise with him, but fails, I'm afraid. So he goes back to India, lives the rest of his life in India. She stays in France. Again, according to his story, there were children born, 2 children born. But again, there's nothing that shows up in the French archive that bears this out. So there's this fascinating story, did they, didn't they actually get married? Was it just a little liaison? What was his role? I mean, clearly this man is a charmer. He's very handsome. He's got these piercing eyes. He's got a large mole next to his nose, which somehow seems to fascinate people. He later on in France, he borrows in inverted commas a jeep from the American soldiers who are escorting them back, and he ends up kind of in the ditch writing off the jeep. He's clearly a wide boy, I guess you might call him. Is he a great hero? Well, who knows? But he's a man who's got a great story that needs to be made into a film, I think.
Oh, I totally agree. There's so many stories out there that you could just, oh God, I don't think I've got enough paper in the world to be able to list all these amazing stories that we could make into films, exactly. Or TV series. Stop making things into films. Making TV series allow you to go deeper into the story rather than just give this person, let's say, max of 2 hours, which is unfair. But there should be a TV series. Let's pitch this. Who do we pitch this to?
Ooh, good question. Dunno. Netflix.
If I knew that would be rich.
Oh, Guy, this has been amazing. I've loved this story. I think people need to go out and buy the book, because obviously we haven't spoken about everything.
No,
Can
indeed.
you please remind our listeners the name of your book?
Yes, it's called The Great Epinal Escape, Indian Soldiers in German Hands. Comes out on the 9th of May from the History Press.
So, yeah, I mean, this has been a fascinating episode, and I've really enjoyed it. And I've got yet another book to add to my ever-growing to-be-read pile. And you should too. So if you head over to our bookstore, bookshop.org, you can buy the book from us. Therefore, we get a little bit of the money, and online bookshops whose name I'm not allowed to mention because I'm sure we'll get sued. According to my youngest, they are currently funding the Inner Earth thing that keeps Godzilla trapped. So don't fund them. Unleash the lizard and buy books from us instead. You can also do a one-off donation at Ko-fi to help buy us a drink or books. I need books. Currently, you need more books on the Austrian Navy, so please consider a one-off donation, and or head over to Patreon for a larger donation and get perks such as a virtual dinner date with me and or a tour of Medway with Alina. So, and thanks again for listening, and leave us a 5-star review. It doesn't cost you anything. It's just be rude not to.